questions too, not just blueberry questions. And yeah, I'm presenting on Beyond Honeybees, Building Towards Resilient Pollination in Blueberry. So blueberries in Washington, it's part of why we're all here today. But if you're not familiar, we're the #1 producer of blueberries in the US. We provide 29% of the national supply. However, this production can be limited by poor. Yeah. I'm sharing the wrong screen, sorry. Oh no. All right, here we go. How many times will it take? Sorry. Is everything good on that side? Okay, good. Anyway, so 29% of the national supply. However, production can be limited by poor pollination, as Lisa just discussed. Good pollination can increase fruit set, berry weight, and yield. However, more honeybees in your field doesn't necessarily actually equal better pollination. This project that we're working on with the WSDA, this is a multi-year project, it really focuses on the concept of integrated crop pollination. So integrated crop pollination is this practice where you combine multiple types of bees, wild bees and bumblebees, and in some places mason and leaf cutter bees, as well as managed honeybees, on top of pesticide stewardship, horticultural practices, and habitat enhancement. So an interesting thing about blueberry that a lot of you might already know is that they are hermaphroditic. They have both male and female reproductive parts, which makes them able to self-fertilize and self-pollinate. But this isn't necessarily super productive for blueberry production and development. So we really emphasize the importance of cross-pollination mediated by insects. Blueberry is capable of 100% fruit set from bloom, and this is generally the goal. But this photo really shows in a nutshell why it's so important to be cross-pollinated. The photo on the left shows a branch that was bagged before bloom, so no insects were able to access these flowers, so no bees, no other anything else. And at the end of pollination for the rest of the field, we took the bag off and there were no berries that developed from this branch. So cross-pollination is super important for berry production. It allows for consistent pollination. So there are a few factors that can affect honeybee and wild bee visitation to blueberry. The shape of blueberry flowers varies by cultivar, actually, and can influence how easily a bee may access nectar and pollen. So some important features of the flower shape, such as the diameter of the flower opening, so also known as the corolla opening here, the depth of the flower, so the corolla length, and the stigma protrusion, so how far the stigma sticks out from the opening of the flower, can either make the flower easier or more difficult for bees to access. So some cultivars, like Liberty, are known for being more difficult to pollinate. And as you can see from this slide, the average corolla opening for Liberty is about 2.3 millimeters. So that's quite small compared to a really common cultivar like Duke. And you can see how a honeybee, the average head size for a honeybee is about 3.76 millimeters. So this is an average. Some honeybees have a little bit bigger heads, some have a little bit smaller. Generally, they can stick their whole head in Duke, in my experience, but Liberty is a little bit more of a struggle. And with other bees that are wild bees, we have the large carpenter bee over here, which has a gigantic head. And this bee cannot access the inside of a blueberry flower at all. So just like bumblebees, they're also quite large. They have to buzz pollinate the flower by vibrating their flight muscles to release pollen. Whereas smaller bees, like these sweat bees down here on the small end, they're more likely to crawl inside the flower. So to really drive this point home, this is my favorite slide. I took these photos in Duke. We have a leaf cutter bee inside the flower here to perfectly picture that, a bumblebee buzz pollinating the flower here, and a honeybee probing for nectar in the base of the flower here. So honeybees are generally rented by growers for blueberry. In fields that are large, honeybees can be really easy, convenient, plentiful, but they may actually need to visit a blueberry flower multiple times before the flower is considered successfully pollinated. So whereas bumblebees and wild bees, they have a little bit more interaction with with pollen directly, whereas honeybees need a few more interactions to really sufficiently transfer enough pollen for successful pollination. So if you're not familiar with the industry in Washington State, we've got two major production regions. We're here in Western Washington, in the Northwest, but there's also another region that is a huge producer down in the Tri-Cities in Central Eastern Washington. These climates are very different. It's a completely different cropscape in both places. And it's a nice little reprieve going over to the east side for my field work because it's nice and sunny and warm there. But for a closer look, just from a satellite image, the west side, as you can see, way more green, way more lush, and a lot of small fruits production in this region. Same thing with Prosser, lots of small fruits production, but it's a lot drier, it's a lot hotter, warmer, pretty consistent weather though. It's a lot more predictable. In the west side, we tend to really load up our fields with honeybees and stock really, really heavily in comparison to the east side, who everybody stocks quite heavily, but it's a little bit more consistent. Days in May, especially this year, there aren't that many days that get over 55 degrees, which is when we see most honeybee pollination, whereas on the east side, that's not quite the case. And even on a on the ground landscape level, you can really see the difference between these fields. In Eastern Washington, you generally see fields as far as the eye can see, whereas you might have a lot more natural habitat and different landscape features in Western Washington nearby. So the objectives for this project are to measure wild bee communities and honeybee density across blueberry landscapes in Washington, estimate the net economic impacts of wild bees, and share findings and incorporate these data into decision aid tools like Lisa mentioned before. But for this talk, we're mostly just talking about measuring the wild bee communities and honeybee densities. So for this project, we have the field set up here. We selected 5 fields in Western Washington and 4 fields in Eastern Washington that ranged in the amount of natural habitat that surrounded the field. So a field with high natural habitat is pictured here on the right side, often had meadow or forest that bordered the field, whereas low natural habitat was generally surrounded by other fields and roads. These little yellow bees, show where our sampling areas primarily were in these fields. And our fields were set up as follows on the left here. So the dark green rectangles are the blueberry rows and the light green are the alleyway. And we had 4 sampling areas where we scan sampled. So we visually wrote down what kind of bees we were seeing flying around in the field. We also put bee bowls, which I will show some pictures in the next slide. And we also had blue vein traps. So those are these red dots in each part of the field. So those are in the field at different depths into the field and then on each edge. So bee bowls are also called pan traps. They are great for catching smaller bees. They're generally ground nesters, lower flyers, typically not reaching high up into the canopy. And then blue vein traps usually select for larger bees that are flying in the canopy. It's hanging on a shepherd's hook, so they're very bright. They're painted with UV paint, and all of these traps were left out for 24 hours at 3 different times during bloom, so at early bloom, mid bloom, and late bloom to sample these communities. Now, to be clear, this doesn't tell us if these bees were actually flying and interacting with blueberries specifically, but it does tell us who was in the field and might have been passing through or might be nesting in the field. We can't really speak to interactions with the crop specifically because we weren't catching them directly off the plant. So just keep that in mind. And to better set the scene for how we did our sampling and what the results looked like, I thought I would use a football field since I'm in the midst of fantasy football right now. So if you picture yourself standing at a field edge, you get out of your truck and you look at your blueberry field. In the first 25 yards of the field, we caught 208 wild bees. We did catch tons of honeybees, but we're only looking at wild bees right now. I haven't even touched the honeybee data. There's so many. But we caught 208 wild bees in the first 25 yards of the field in all of these fields combined. In the next 25 yards, so between 25 and 50 yards into the field, we caught 142 wild bees across all of these fields. In the next distance interval was 113 wild bees from 50 to 75 yards into the field. And smack dab in the middle of most of these fields, we caught about 110 wild bees. These are mostly sweat bees, a little bit of bumblebees, but we'll talk more about what we are seeing trend-wise in a minute. And then from the field perimeters, we caught 888 wild bees, which is really fun and really exciting. It was a huge amount of bees. And this doesn't really tell us what was going on inside of the field, but it really offers great context for communities that exist in that immediate area surrounding these fields and who might be possibly entering the field if given the right opportunity. Now, for further context with these bees, they're all very small. Most of them can't fly farther than a football field. So the ones we're seeing in the middle of the field at 75 to 100 yards are likely nesting in the field. So these are general trends from across all the fields we visited. These tiny bees, maybe at maximum, who are nesting in the field aren't ever actually leaving the field, which is really fun to think about. And I think there's a lot more going on in our fields wild bee nesting wise than we realized. So for a total of 1,460 bees that I caught in blueberry fields this year. So this is super exciting. But why do we care about these edges? Why do we care about, bees in edge effects? This is pretty common. If you know anything about insects, people often say, there's way more insects on the edge and it kind of tapers as you go into the field. Well, in some crops, we might actually see increased yields on the edges of fields based on landscape and wild bees in that landscape. So we're really interested in seeing if that's the same trend in blueberry here. And so I have 6 boxes of bees. They're really beautiful. I'm really excited. And they're going to Yakima tomorrow to be identified by the Washington Bee Atlas. I could do some of these identifications myself, but it would take way too long for the rest of my PhD. So we're really excited. I texted some of these photos to some of our growers and they were really impressed with what's coming out of their fields and, delightfully surprised. So moving forward, we saw here's some data for wild bee abundance in early and late blooming cultivars with proximity to field edge. So we're not going to go too into depth with this, but the early blooming cultivar in high natural habitat saw lots of solitary bees at the edge with a slight drop as you get deeper into the field. We think that perhaps blueberry acts as a really great place to get food early in the season, kind of regardless of where you are location-wise. The foraging resources in these high natural habitats have not quite set in yet. We're not seeing a ton of wildflower bloom in early April and mostly more as you get into May. It's really interesting seeing a pretty similar trend with bumblebees across all 4 of these landscape contexts and cultivars. So we think that it's mostly just queens that we collected. We collected a handful of workers, some males, but queens at this time of year during blueberry bloom, it's super early. They're out looking for nesting areas. And so they haven't had their babies and they haven't developed a huge amount of workers that are out foraging yet. So that's why we're mostly seeing so many more solitary bees than bumblebees at this time of year. And then surrounding landscape, we have some berry data. This is just for Duke and just for Western Washington and 2 cultivars. So this is Duke and Liberty. This is 1 year of data. We can't really speak conclusively about any of this, but this is from 5 different fields. Interestingly, we're seeing higher berry weights in high natural habitat on the field edges, and that drops a little bit. Whereas in low natural habitat, berry weights are kind of rising as you get deeper into the field. This is super inconclusive, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's a really interesting trend we're excited about exploring as we get further. And to cap it off, as Lisa advertised in her last talk, I just finished up this, or we just finished up this guide for best practices for blueberry pollination. I'm super, super proud of it. It's been a year of work. It's 30 pages of information, but I swear it's all readable. My mom gets it. So I'm really excited and sent it to the in-laws and they get it too. So I can't wait for you all to see it. We have some reference cards back there. It's not on the internet yet. We got the PDF back this week. So hopefully it'll be in use before you guys' next pollination season. But, and I want to say thank you to our funding agency, the WSTA, the Washington Bee Atlas, everybody that helped me with my field work. This has been a huge effort. And Lisa in the small fruit horticulture lab, and of course our grower cooperators, we couldn't do it without all of you. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? I have no idea how much time we have.
We'll get you a question.
Thanks for the presentation. I just had a question about the wild bees that you think are perhaps nesting in the fields. Did you observe any differences between fields that had landscape fabric over the raised beds versus those that were just a sawdust mulch?
That's a great question. We actually hadn't thought about that much. Mostly in Eastern Washington, we see weed mat over the raised bed. In Eastern Washington, we're seeing just more like wood mulch. I hadn't looked into that, but I will now more so. I'm really curious. We saw a ton of these tiny bees, like mostly Halictus and Lasioglossum sweat bees, coming out of Eastern Washington from inside the fields. We saw a lot in Western Washington, but I think there's more dirt exposed in some places in Eastern Washington, so that in the alleyways. So that could be why. It also could be that there's a dearth of resources outside of the crop. So that could be part of it. So there may not be a whole lot of nesting habitat elsewhere, which provides a great opportunity within the crop, whereas we might not see that as much in Western Washington. That's a great question. I'm going to actually look into that even further.
We have one more question while Molly switches presentations.
I got a question. Any of your studies or you got any data that shows using a bee pheromone affecting pollination?
Could you repeat that? There's a lot of background noise. That was about bee pheromone?
That's right. Any studies or data on that? Does that make a difference, especially when a grower has a really long rows?
Does it make a difference when the growers have really long rows?
I think that's a good question. So there are some fields that you go 100 yards in and you're very close to the end of the row. So really you kind of see a double edge effect. So I'm sure we need to suss that out a little bit more and kind of take note of our fields that are maybe a little bit smaller. I don't think I have a good answer to that question right now, but I'm happy to chat more with you about this after.